Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to episode 10 of Humanity versus Insanity, the Crane Report. Now, this show tonight is not quite live because when it goes out on Monday, April 28th, I will actually be giving a talk by the same name, Humanity versus Insanity, in St Anne's in the northwest of England. So we're recording this on Thursday afternoon, and I'm extremely grateful to my guest today, Patrick Henningsen, for stepping into the breach at pretty much the last minute. But there again, I'm just getting my own back because he did the same to me on his radio show at the weekend. So Patrick is, in my opinion, right now, quite possibly the world's leading researcher and broadcaster in deep geopolitics. Patrick's work covering the events in North America, particularly surrounding the Bureau of Land Management's confrontation with Cliven Bundy over in Nevada, has been right on the money. Other alternative media groups, which shall remain nameless, have actually not really stepped up to the plate. And one can only wonder why they've given this important issue such scant coverage. Now, Patrick's not only a great researcher, a great broadcaster, he's also a good friend, and he will be one of the contributors to the forthcoming AV5 event. Now, when you're watching this, AV5 will be just a little under 3 weeks away. It is a residential event at the Staverton Park Hotel. This is actually a spa venue. So there's a lot of facilities there, and it's outstanding value because for 3 nights of full board accommodation, the cost is just £200, and that's single occupancy, or £175 if you share a room. Unfortunately, that is in addition to the conference cost, but full details can be found on the Alternative View website, which is alternativeview.co.uk, or if it's easier to remember, av5.info. Now, this is going to be an event that is intended to make a real difference. It's not going to be an event where people simply sit around listening to a train of speakers. This is going to be an event where we are going to be looking to bring together people who fully comprehend the magnitude of the threat that humanity is facing right now, and are motivated and determined to participate in bringing about the changes that we all know we need to see. And it is truly staggering how many people are really now starting to wake up to the magnitude of the onslaught that humanity is facing. Just last night, I spent an hour or so talking to a guy who's 23 years of age, and I have to say his level of awareness was truly remarkable. He's way ahead of my curve. I mean, he has a level of awareness that I didn't see until I was pretty much about twice his age. And if this is indicative of the younger generation, then I feel heartened that the legacy that my generation is in danger of leaving the next generations, they're not going to permit that. They're going to join the fight, and they are going to ensure that humanity does indeed fight this insanity. So if you have an opportunity to join us on May 16th through, that's Friday, May 16th through Monday, May the 19th, then please check the website out. And maybe if your partner is not necessarily into these topics, then bring him or her along and let them enjoy the spa facilities of the Staverton Park Hotel. And even I know there are 1 or 2 people who are going to come along to the hotel and sort of just join in, the social aspects of the event. So this is going to be an event that really does make a difference. And Patrick, I'm pleased to acknowledge that you're part of the team right now that is making a massive difference. So thanks very much for coming on to Humanity versus Insanity at such short notice.
My pleasure, Ian. It's good to be with you today.
Now, Patrick, I've been following your reports on events in Nevada over the last few weeks. Of course, I have been somewhat focused on what's been occurring at Barton Moss, and I'll be talking more about that in Fracking Nightmare, which will be going out at 9 o'clock on the evening of Monday, 28th of April. So you, in my opinion, have been on point here, certainly as far as the UK alternative media is concerned, in reporting the events at the Bundy Ranch. So, Patrick, how did you get so close to this?
I have a show on GMN, radio show every Sunday called The Sunday Wire, and that's on the Guerrilla Media Network, GMN. And GMN's flagship show is the Pete Santilli show, and Pete had been one of the first people to interview Cliven Bundy, the rancher whose land was occupied by the U.S. federal government, and so he felt compelled after that interview to leave the studio completely on short notice and go down to the ranch because he believed that whole situation needed to be documented, and also that those ranchers needed some additional support. And by doing that, he kind of put himself right there at the beginning of the story, and because of his work and like the video that he shot of police tasering residents and so forth made national news, and that increased awareness, and thousands of people showed up within days. And eventually that story ended up in the federal government having to withdraw their activities on the ranch. They were basically rounding up the Bundy's cattle, prize herd, free grazing cattle, I might add, off of his ranch. They're grazing over 600,000 acres of that part of the Nevada desert, and over a dispute over fees, which Bundy had paid to the state of Nevada and not to the federal government. He paid them to the state because he said he no longer recognized the federal government's jurisdiction because they were simply managing the land, but not doing anything that was in their actual remit to help rotate grazing and look after the property. He was doing it himself, so he said, I'll pay the money, but not to the federal government. And then 200 armed federal agents basically came onto the land and started taking his cattle and killing the cattle, shooting him in the back of the head from helicopters, and killed some from exhaustion, and had the family at gunpoint, essentially. So Americans resonated with this story, many did, and came out in droves to support him. Of course, you have the naysayers who basically, he was portrayed by the sort of, I would say, left-wing media as a deadbeat who didn't pay his bills. But of course, they didn't tell the full story. So, but it's been left to the alternative media, Ian, to really cover the story. There was a media blackout. A lot of that was straight out of the White House, ordered to MSNBC and other major networks not to send any crew down. And so you had a situation after the federal government announced they would withdraw. They then amassed an armed force comprised of SWAT teams and other paramilitary mercenary contractors with federal badges on at the cattle pen when the 100-odd cowboys and supporters walked 2 miles to take their cattle back. They were met with the guns of the federal government. It was a bit of an ambush. And luckily, no shots were fired. The federal government stood down, but they only really, I believe, one of the reasons they stood down was not only because they were in the wrong, but there were hundreds of citizen militia backing the peaceful protesters. And all this because the local sheriff was hiding under his desk, essentially. He didn't want to be involved. And in America, the local sheriff is the peacekeeper that usually keeps citizens and local communities safe from any violence. So in this case, the federal government came with violence, and there was no sheriff, no deputies, nothing. Well, law enforcement just stayed away. So it was up to citizens who have a legal right to bear arms in America to to protect the Bundy family and the interests of the local community. But as we find out, Ian, and what we'll discuss later in the show, is there's a lot of plans for this land. It wasn't originally that they came in with the guns and the troops because apparently the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, had filed an Endangered Species Act on the desert tortoise. But we find out that the desert tortoise wasn't really in danger, and that was just an excuse to come in to occupy the land, to drive the last farmer off, and then basically appropriate and lease out this land for various other projects like fracking, oil, solar farms, etc. over the coming years.
Well, in fact, let's take a look at that, Patrick. I've got up on the screen here a map which shows the amount of land, i.e. in red, effectively owned or claimed to be owned by the federal government. And this is the state of Nevada. And I think the percentage is that the state of Nevada is 82% owned by the federal government, which means that the state legislature effectively only has jurisdiction over just 18% of the state. And as you rightly say, I mean, what's been occurring over the past few decades is that the federal government has been buying up more and more land, particularly in the western states. Here we've got New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, sorry, this is New Mexico here. No, this is New Mexico. Gosh, got to get my geography correct. This is California. Much of this is really the area to the east of the Rocky Mountains. These are the Rocky Mountains running up sort of through here. But this is an enormous amount of land owned by the federal government. So in your opinion, Patrick, why is the federal government making these grabs for land and now trying to force US citizens off that land?
Well, it's kind of a complicated story, but I'll give you this in as much short detail as I can. A number of the western states, because they were settled later in the Union of States in the United States, had various clauses in there, and many of those had to do with things like secession. So let's say during the Civil War period, Nevada was just an emerging territory that became one of the later states. There was big fear, and when new states came on in the United States, that they might want to secede from the Union. So there were clauses put in the state constitutions that allowed the federal government in Washington extra jurisdiction over those lands. So Nevada is one such state. But the other thing is when you go eastwards, a lot of the United States, the states own their own land, okay? So public lands are owned by the states. What happened, because the West Coast states, for the most part, many of them are much bigger in terms of scale and square mileage. The BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, and also you have the national parks and other sort of, like the National Trust in the UK. They've come on the scene in the last few years. Their original remit was to work as partners with farmers and livestock farmers to manage the land. I say manage, not own. And the amount of money that they would collect in fees would be enough only to pay the salaries of BLM, Bureau of Land Management employees, and also some administrative costs, and that was it. What has happened is they've turned this into sort of a revenue-generating machine, whereby they've been able to not only collect revenue and capital in order to actually purchase land, but they've been able to do so in some cases by fraudulent means. In other words, by heaping on the regulations, by changing the zoning or various other administrative things with regards to property, they've been able to move farmers or put people out of business to get them off the land, and then they would then take over the land and maybe buy it, I don't know, through various schemes and whatever. So they've turned into a kind of property management, into a sort of a state agent to a property owner. Okay, and we found out through our research this week that the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, is not a government agency. It's a private corporation, which is an extension of the U.S. Department of Interior, but has been given some sort of law enforcement and other sort of powers delegated to it by the federal government, much in the same way that the IRS, the Inland Revenue Service in America, is not really an official government agency. It's a revenue collecting arm of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, itself a privately owned corporation or interest. So, of course, these things are being discovered now because people are asking questions. Why are they coming in so hot and heavy? What was the rush? Was there a timetable that they were trying to meet? Were there deals being signed? And we find out, lo and behold, that yes, there were many, many deals that are in the process. Who knows, in projecting forward 20, 30, 40 years. So certainly that's the case with the Bundy Ranch. Okay,
Patrick, I'm just going to make an observation for people watching this, that you're not in an earthquake zone yet. We'll talk more about that in a while. But your bunker there in the capital of the country, in London, is very close to the London Underground system. Yeah, and so we have a pretty good idea when a train goes past you, because we can all hear it.
We're in Damascus right now, so that's,
yeah, really.
Those are incoming ordinances.
Yeah, well, unfortunately there are those who wish that was true, namely Obama and Cameron, but hopefully we can continue to thwart that. Now, Patrick, I'm going to make an observation here. Now, you obviously, as an American national, feel free to react as you deem appropriate. But I'm going to make the observation that there really is no such country as the United States of America. And unfortunately, even the autonomy of the states, and particularly the Western states, is being eroded at a phenomenal rate of knots. In fact, very few people in Europe actually comprehend that up until certainly recently, the state governor and the state legislatures in the US actually have more autonomy than national governments in Europe. Although, of course, the federal government is trying to change that. But the federal government is, in reality, the legislature group of the banksters. I mean, basically, the US is a corporatocracy. It is owned by the global corporatists. The military that is presented as the US military is not the US military at all. The military that is spread right across the globe is effectively the militia of the global banksters. That's why the US military, i.e. the militia of the global banksters, their primary task is to destroy those nations that still retain financial autonomy, those nations that operate outside of the central banking system. So the reality is that the US is effectively a rogue state because it is not a nation state. So, Patrick, your observations on those comments?
Well, a lot of that's down to how you interpret, what you define as a nation state. It acts and it functions effectively as a nation state, but what you said is absolutely correct. And I think one of the big shifts took place in the mid-1900s after the Civil War, when the United States became the United States of America, and presidencies became administrations. And if you know anything about receivership and bankruptcy, you know what the word administration means when you go into administration. So it means that you're not really in control of your own affairs in terms of decision making and whatnot. But America is essentially 50 states, and when the Union was formed, each state had autonomy as if a nation state. The federal government, the central government, was there to regulate interstate disputes, other things like, negotiate international trade tariffs, deal with border disputes, fishing rights, and these sort of things. So it's a bit like if you live in a apartment complex or a building and everyone owns their flat, but there's a housing association or someone who takes care of the landscaping and the lifts and other maintenance to do with the building. And what you have now is a situation in the United States where that housing association or tenants association, that group is not just doing the landscaping and dealing with the exterior maintenance of the building. They're actually inside your kitchen, eating food out of your fridge every day, sleeping in your bed, using your toilet, and not wiping the seat. Okay. In the U.S. Constitution, the 10th Amendment is very, very clear. It says, powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Okay, and that's so the big debate now. It's taken 150 years to come to the fore. But what is the law of the land in the United States? Is it the U.S. Constitution, or is it all the various other laws, executive orders, and heaps of policy that have been piled on top of it? Okay, so you still have the original framework of that country, and this is a central flashpoint with regards to the Bundy Ranch. And what Bundy Ranch was it was a small event that really took on some big themes. So, and you realize at that point, if you are being subjugated by a central government and you're in a local community, be it a county or a city or a town or a hamlet or a village, what defense do you have against an invading force? And so essentially the federal government acting like a foreign government. It would be the same in Britain, Ian, if forces, national police forces, were mobilized from around the country, which you have seen them do this in the past, from Scotland, from Cumbria, whatever, assembled down in London to deal with the G8 protest or to deal with the situation at Barton Mosque. That is essentially, to people in the local community, that is a foreign force coming in. And I say foreign doesn't have to be outside of your borders. And why would they come in with heavy guns, with armament, with aggression? And in the case of the Bundy Ranch, much the same, Ian, as at Barton Mosque in Manchester. There are corporate interests behind everything. And more, this is becoming clearer and clearer as they make an end run for resources. But not only that, it's to set a precedent. And I think in the case of the UK, it's a much smaller, much more highly densely populated island. So we have a lot more pressing issues maybe than in some places in the United States, where you're talking about much bigger geographical areas and where sort of toxic waste and pollution and corporate malfeasance can be covered up simply with bulldozers and a few gates saying, do not pass this road. So, the UK is in a much more pressing situation in that regard.
Excuse me. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Patrick. And, the militarization of the police is certainly something that we're seeing in the UK, and we'll talk more about that in a second, but not to the same extent as in the US. And I saw this picture a few days ago, and I mean, we know already, of course, that the sheriff's department is becoming increasingly militarized with Humvees, and here we've got an armored personnel carrier. And of course, again, what people from outside the US don't appreciate is that each of the states actually has their own version of the military, because it is still illegal for the US military to be deployed on the streets of the United States. So each of the states has a version of the military, the National Guard, and of course members of the National Guard were effectively recruited into the US military to be assigned to Afghanistan and to Iraq or to anywhere else that the banksters wish to deploy their militia. But one of the disturbing things that I've heard more recently, Patrick, is that the federal government is now confiscating some of the top-end military hardware from the National Guard. The various National Guards around the country. So the report that I read said that National Guards were having their Apache helicopters confiscated, and some of their top-end hardware, like armored personnel characters. So, you know, this would indicate that the federal government is actually trying to do what it has done very effectively, you know, with other countries, not least Libya, you know, get them to disarm. And then, of course, the moment that they disarm, then, of course, there's no real opposition, and so you can wade in and take it over. You know, whilst these countries retained even at least the perception that they had some form of capability to respond to an outside attack, then they were left alone. But the moment that it was believed that they had complied with the Western world's wish, i.e. the global banksters' wish, disarmed in return for preferential trade agreements or whatever, then of course the militia walks into the country and takes over all the natural resources. And my perception is that we are seeing the various United States, the individual states, being prepared for a federal takeover by having their defenses removed. Your comments, Patrick?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, normally the National Guard will be reservists, very similar in Britain to the TA, the Territorial Army. Some people call them weekend warriors, is a kind of slang, but you know, but they fall under as a branch of the U.S. military, so they're fully public, fully accountable, and they're accountable to the American people at the end of the day. And one of Obama's jobs, when he's been elected, he's got a laundry list of things that he had to complete in his first term by the people who put him in office, and one of them was to dismantle, to help dismantle the decision-making structure in the U.S. military, and also to, I believe, dismantle National Guard units as well, to be replaced with a Hessianized forces, a domestic army, which is basically under the umbrella of the Department of Homeland Security. And then also they're trying to arm up a number of other federal agencies like the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, and many others. But what Homeland Security is, what people don't understand, Homeland Security doesn't have so many full-time employees. What it is, it's kind of like a government Halliburton. It's a giant contracting spider. So and then we'll have a number of contractors on its books, people on call. It'll appropriate let's say the local SWAT team from a city that has a SWAT team, and it'll band together through what's called fusion centers and fusion activities in order to assemble its force, but would have all its own equipment and so forth. They're better equipped than most of the U.S. troops who were occupying Iraq for 10 years. And one has to ask the question, this is no longer a joke, Ian. People used to say, you know, they have a domestic army they're building. So, you know, it's real. You know, they're amassing all this power, and then all this, you know, equipment, heavy guns, grenade launchers, you know, things for domestic unrest. A number of the drills, the paces they're going through are about domestic enemies. It's almost if they're anticipating that there's going to be some sort of civil unrest, whether that's going to be induced by the government itself or coming as a result of an economic collapse. But this is frightening because there are right now a list of 8 million people in the United States. I forgot which agency has the list, but they're due to be rounded up if the you-know-what hits the fan. And that's the first line. And then there's a number of other things. So in order to make this work, you need to disarm the American population. because the people far outnumber how many contractors they can put into place, or even foreign contractors they might, proper Hessians, which they might hire in the event of such a situation. But the goal is from Secret Service people that have intimated this to, they have since left the country. Other people, ex-NSA, they've left the country. They've intimated to people like John Whitehead, who has an article on 21st Century Wire today, that they want to have the country on lockdown by 2020. And so they're going to be, in the next 2 years, ramping up drone surveillance and long-term flights in the air, drones for surveillance and maybe other things as well. So this is a horrific sort of thing, and it's almost that they're anticipating some sort of, horrible situation. And I think, President Obama has definitely contributed in driving the country to that direction, and so has the Bush administration, who really assembled the Department of Homeland Security, which was on the drawing board during the Clinton administration. So it's not as if any of these things have popped up as a result of any one president. So it is frightening when you go in and read how, if anybody is, let's say, for a number of things, will be characterized, labeled as a terrorist, some of the most ridiculous check boxes that are being circulated in memos and stuff like that, that, if you believe in the U.S. Constitution, then you might be a domestic terrorist, like paying with cash. If you have a blog, this is a country that tries to purport internationally to be some sort of beacon of freedom and democracy, and it is assembling the most pernicious, most comprehensive police state, fascist police state, corporatist state that the world has ever seen. So I find it absolutely gobsmacking to hear some of the rhetoric coming out of the vice president, the president, our State Department, when they're gallivanting around in places like the Ukraine right now, trying to start they've effectively started a civil war in that country, in Syria, and the list goes on and on. We can talk about that at length. But that is what's happening in the United States. And the reason is because the U.S. is one of the most heavily armed populations in the world. And I know there's a lot of people I speak to every day in Europe that are just horrified at the thought of a citizen owning a firearm, because people automatically assume, because they have never handled a firearm, because they haven't grown up in America or live in America, that it's dangerous to have guns around. And that's not true. If you're raised with firearms and you're trained in how to use them, we saw a situation at the Bundy Ranch at 500 militia, didn't fire one shot. And observers from the U.S. military who were at the Bundy Ranch, who were supporting the Bundys, made the remarks, including a lieutenant colonel, by the way, that the citizen volunteer militia was better trained, more disciplined, and better organized than the federal forces that were across the road. Okay, so that should tell you, if you have any fears that if you're well trained and you're well organized and you're disciplined and you're there for the right reasons under constitutional principles, the likelihood that any shot is going to be fired in an untoward fashion is very, very low. Yep. Almost nil, in fact. Yeah,
Patrick, I would certainly agree with you. I mean, I, as you know, lived in Texas for a number of years, and Texas, of course, has the right to bear arms. In fact, the right to bear concealed arms, except in a place where alcohol is on sale. And I can argue the case both ways, and I certainly support your view. Where you have a culture where people are raised, where firearms are readily available. And in fact, I mean, in Texas, when my teenage children started to drive, when their friends, particularly the girls, when their friends got their first car, then their fathers would give them their first firearm. And the firearm, of course, was a fixture in the glove compartment. And as you rightly say, I mean, these firearms are not just given away, they're all licensed. And certainly, people have to go through the appropriate training, and it does have a calming effect. You never see road rage in Texas, and you would very rarely see any trouble in bars unless it was, a bar that had a reputation, in which case firearms were not permitted inside the bar. But generally, it was, a calming influence. But I would never recommend the citizens to have the wider right to bear arms in, say, the UK, because we have no culture of firearms. The farming community, different ball game. The rural community, different ball game. But people in the cities, they can't even be trusted with, a can opener, let alone firearms.
Sure. Yeah, the state has a monopoly on force in the UK, a complete monopoly, and that's the way they want to make it. A certain people in America want that to be the case in the United States. The reason there is a Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, is because of this. When that law was put on the books at the beginning of that country's founding, they didn't have police forces and metropolitan police forces with thousands of officers, with huge budgets and all sorts of firearms and people that they could call on, police cars. Basically, the law enforcement was the local sheriff. And the local sheriff, when there was a problem, he would then deputize his posse. That posse would be comprised of farmers, citizens, and these are meant to be neutral people, not stakeholders in whatever was going on, that they could be called on. That was part of their duty as a citizen to basically, when they're called by the sheriff, to muster up and show up and do what needs to be done, whether that's, a dispute or, a criminal matter or whatever. And that is also the case if there was throughout history, if there's a foreign invasion, the Mexican-American War, for instance, citizen militias, well-organized, regulated militias played big roles in that.
But the Alamo, remember the Alamo?
Yeah. So, that what you have is it's a power struggle at the end of the day. It's between local communities and interests and the federal government, which is essentially functioning like a foreign government if you consider that all 50 states should have a high degree of autonomy. As was the case when the country was founded. Indeed.
Now, Patrick, you said earlier that we'd be talking about some of the reasons behind the land grab, and we've only got about 7 or so minutes remaining in the show, and I think it's important that we make these links. First of all, I want to make the observation that if we look at the screen here, this is a sign put up by the Bureau of Land Management, effectively closing off public land. And in anticipation of local objections, they set up something that we've seen in this country in recent years. In the US, of course, it's referred to as the First Amendment area. In this country, they are called protest zones. And this is the federal government, and in the UK, of course, the national government saying, yeah, we recognise your right to free speech, but only in the corralled area. And fortunately, the people who turned up to support the Bundys basically told them where to shove their First Amendment area, just like we've been telling the UK authorities where to shove their protest zones. We will do what we need to do, and we will not be corralled. But in terms of the land grab in the US, obviously it is very much linked into the much deeper agenda of Agenda 21, and I think Patrick will probably save that discussion for another day. But particularly in the western states, we are looking at the remarkable synchronicity between the land grab and the shale plays over here in the western states. And as I've discussed with you before, it's no real surprise to me, and I'm sure not to you, that the contrived situation in the Ukraine and Crimea, giving the US Global Corporatist administration, that's an excellent term, the administration, because of course the US is $17.2 trillion in debt to the global corporatists. So what they've done is created a situation where they're now trying to get sanctions placed on Russia and trying to get Western Europe to stop buying gas from Russia. And lo and behold, this coincides with the US shale gas industry pretty much being ready to start export, because the shale gas plays in the US have now been so excessively developed that gas production in the US far outstrips national demand, and they want to do something with it, so they want to export it. And now the plan, of course, is to replace the gas that was being exported into the EU and now replace that with US gas. Perfect timing, wouldn't you say, Patrick?
Yeah, sure. You know, only a few months ago, energy pundits and market pundits were saying the U.S. has got a gas glut. So the price of natural gas was so low in the U.S. and compared to gas in Europe, or gas being LNG, liquid gas being exported from Qatar to places like Great Britain, where we have LNG terminals set up in the south of England to convert that. But so yes, the situation is glut market, low prices, and all of a sudden crisis in the Ukraine and sanctions. But the problem is, here's the problem. I think this is it is a long play to a degree, but it's also a short play, Ian, because the gas coming to Europe from Russia and into other parts of Eastern Europe coming by pipeline, it's incredibly cheaper because the infrastructure is already built. The product itself is cheaper. The stuff that's going to have to be exported from the U.S., and you're going to have LNG, liquid gas conversions. It raises the price. For instance, what we import from Qatar is roughly 3 to 4 times the price of what's coming off the Russian Nord Stream and South Stream pipelines. Okay, and Britain is willing to pay that price, to pay over the odds to an Arab country.
Hang on a second, let me just make one observation. The UK does not import gas from Russia today. This is the Department of Energy's own statistics, and it is acknowledged that perhaps 0.4% of the UK's gas usage does actually emanate from Russia, because we take some gas from German storage facilities. But the bulk of UK gas comes from the UK's own gas resources, mainly offshore, of course, and also from Norway, and then some from Belgium and from the Netherlands. But of course, Cameron, when he's pushed on it, does acknowledge that to date we don't get much gas from Russia, but of course that's never let the facts get in the way of the story that you need to maintain a good crisis.
Yeah, but Germany, a country like Germany, does import quite a bit of gas from a country like Russia. But you know this, Ian, from your knowledge of the activities of a company like iGas. Let's say a fracking company hasn't even drilled yet, it's just done exploratory drilling. One announcement here for one of these companies, one announcement there, all of a sudden you see their share prices skyrocket. So the announcement of sanctions and then some hype talk about the U.S. Basically supplying Europe to fill the Russian natural gas gap is just you're going to see share prices go up and spike. And then the reality is that's going to take a lot longer to organize. So unless we're looking at a protracted conflict in the Ukraine, a protracted crisis, which I don't see it going that long, even if we have a civil war, I think it's going to be wrapped up and sorted out very quickly within a year or so. That's not enough for the industry to reconfigure itself. But what it shows you is the disruptive ability to disrupt markets, to disrupt prices of commodities by strictly through foreign policy subterfuge from Washington and London and Paris.
Absolutely.
And they've been playing this game for so long with the oil, as you well know, Ian, and with the Saudi Arabia and with the OPEC countries, just basically playing with the price of energy. And we at the end, we are the end sufferers, because we end up paying more for everything. When fuel prices go up, the price of everything goes up. And this is the price of geopolitical games that's not revealed often, or doesn't appear in the speeches of our economic geniuses and sages like George Osborne, or other people who are, big commentators on this subject. So,
well, that's because they're fundamentally on the global corporatist payroll, and as we well know, they get their marching orders at the national, or the sort of global jamboree, the forthcoming event, of course, being the Bilderberger meeting, which will be held somewhere in Scandinavia. But wherever it is that the usual suspects tell you that the meeting is being held, that's purely to corral the alternative community and put them in a First Amendment zone or a protest zone, just like they did at the Grove in Watford. Anybody who believes that the Bilderberger meeting last year was actually held at the Grove is unfortunately suffering from a delusion. The Bilderberger meeting was held elsewhere, just as it will be in Scandinavia this year. So it's a case of this time, hopefully the alternative community will use its investigative capability and capacity to nail down the exact location rather than the pretend location.
Yeah, Ian, I read an article a couple weeks ago. You probably saw it. Was Bilderberg 2014, Beware of the Red Herring in Copenhagen. And it was one of the first time anybody saw this in print about last year's Bilderberg, about the real steering committee meetings happening at Celestin Park in Croydon. And the sort of show Bilderberg was up at the Grove in Watford. And let me tell you what a violent reaction I got from some people in the alternative media, but most of them just went completely silent. And I have gotten basically indications from people who would know that that is in fact correct. And most of it was because of the sort of glib response you could tell from certain people, like I had just popped a huge bubble. But that is the fact. And yeah, so there is, the alternative media needs to realize that they can be led like sheep, just like the mainstream media leads the general populace. We're not immune to that by any means, and you just have to sharpen up your fact-checking skills and know that you're motivated for the right reasons and not to go to a party per se.
Absolutely. Patrick, we're right out of time, and I know this is a discussion that will be continued. Meanwhile, of course, keep your eyes on what's going on in Nevada with the Bundys. The federal forces may have backed off for the moment, but they got a bit of a flea in their ear, and they're not going to take this humiliation lightly. So watch what's coming next. And if it's not appearing in the British mainstream media, then you know where to find it. 21st Century Wire should be your first port of call. Patrick Henningsen's Newsline. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us. Looking forward to your presentation at AV5. I know you've got a real barnstormer lined up, and I know that you're going to challenge perceptions in a big way. So thanks for joining us tonight, and we'll catch you next week.